Chapter 41. The Snow Queen Plays Baseball. Despite all his confident claims of knowing this would happen and being used to it, Jack would have been lying if he said seeing the Dragon Riders again, but not being seen in return, didn't bother him. And saying it only bothered him would have been an understatement. It made him feel somewhat ungrateful. Jaime had made all the kids believe he still had the twins and, most importantly, he had Hiccup. He did know this would happen, and even if he'd been human for a few months, he should be used to it. And yet, he ignored his hurt feelings as best he could as he headed for the clouds hanging over Berk, circling the island. Already, he could feel the Snow Queen's power building up, devastating winter lurking just around the corner. Jack closed his eyes and extended his senses across the barbaric archipelago. He couldn't quite pinpoint her presence, but he could pinpoint the exact position of every island they'd visited on their journey, and then some more. He could tell which ones had living creatures on them, and what kind of living creatures. Humans, dragons, the mysterious shifting aura of magical entities. But not snow. It would have been nice if they'd gotten some allies along the way, but those were, as they all knew by now, hard to come by in the archipelago. He wrapped the island in his magic. At least that was something that came easily back to him, even if he still felt weak from the fever. As long as everyone stayed put on the island, they should be safe. Snow's puppets would hopefully not be able to break through, and if they somehow did anyway, the dragons should be able to fight back without Snow's magic hurting them from the inside like she'd done to Toothless before. Of course, Jack had no way to give this a test run, so who knew really what would happen? He only hoped Hiccup and Jaime managed to warn the others. Even if they didn't believe the magical part of it, they had to believe something was about to attack them. By the same enemy as last time, too. Jack would have gladly been the one to warn them again, but, well. He opened his eyes when he heard the familiar sound of Toothless's wings beating. They were still far away. Jack's hearing was better now, and he could hear them clearly even from a distance. Or maybe it was more like he felt them move through the air. He smiled and headed up into the cover of the clouds, taking a wide U-turn before coming back down right behind Toothless and Hiccup. Soundlessly, he floated close to Hiccup's ear. That didn't take long. Boy and dragon let out matching yelps, Toothless whirling around so suddenly the force made Hiccup face plant onto Toothless's head. He groaned as Toothless steadied himself, massaging his nose. "Why?" he complained, but Jack could barely hear him over his own laughter. Hiccup stared at him, cheeks red, with an unwilling smile on his face while he waited for Jack to calm down. "Okay," he said when the cackling had subsided to soft fits of giggles. "You're definitely exhausted. You don't usually laugh that hard after scaring me." I'm fine. Oh, hello, Toothless." Toothless had come closer to him, bumping his head against Jack's shoulder. Jack laughed softly, scratching his jaw. "I told you we had a lot in common. Flying, mainly." Hiccup hummed, and Jack could tell he was thinking back to that moment on the edge. "Gods," he murmured. "That's why you tried leaping after your staff." "Oh, I tried leaping off several high places. It's a wonder I didn't get myself killed." "Truly," Hiccup agreed with a lopsided smile. "The gods must be looking out for you." Jack would have blushed if he could. "Hiccup, we don't have a lot of time left. Are you really going to spend it all making fun of me?" "For being so oblivious Freya herself had to come down and give you a nudge?" Hiccup asked. "Absolutely." Jack flew over Toothless's head and crouched weightlessly in front of Hiccup. Hiccup instinctively pulled back a little, something that sounded like a nervous laugh escaping him. Jack raised a brow. "Is it strange?" he asked. Hiccup's breath stood out when he exhaled. I'd be lying if I said no," he said, a slight tremor in his voice, though it sounded more like he was holding back a laugh than that he was apprehensive. He moved forward again, and Jack had to fight the urge to pull back as well. Their faces were so close. "It's okay, though. I never expected anything but strange from you. But speaking of Freya," he reached down to a bag tied to the saddle and pulled out an armful of brown feathers. Freya's cloak. "Jaime asked me to give you this. Thought it might help you." He gingerly held it out to Jack, as if he were afraid it would spontaneously combust if he handled it too roughly. Still, he seemed anxious to get it off his hands. Jack couldn't blame him. Personally, he'd never believed in the Norse gods, but even he felt a bit awe-stricken, both by meeting a goddess and accidentally stealing her cloak. Or maybe, more likely, Freya had meant to give it to him. As he took the cloak, now magically his size again, and brought it around his shoulders, he knew he had the goddess's blessings. "Must be a peculiar feeling," Hiccup mused.
Knowing you harbor so much love, you get a whole goddess's attention.
Jack snorted to hide his embarrassment and was about to come up with some wry reply when Toothless suddenly beat his wings and sped up. Maybe it would have been romantic, falling into Hiccup's arms, but all that happened was that their foreheads knocked together.
This keeps happening,
Hiccup noted as Jack pushed himself away, laughing. Let's do it the old-fashioned way, then, he suggested, then stood and flipped over Hiccup's head, landing on Toothless's back. Instead of sitting down properly, however, Jack remained in a crouched position, holding onto the saddle with one hand. Hiccup turned halfway around, sending him a dubious look.
You call that the old-fashioned way?
Hey, I'm not going to fall off, Jack said. He didn't mention how good it felt to sit down. He really was exhausted. Did you talk to the others? Hiccup didn't immediately answer. He opened his mouth, then looked into the air silently, weighing his words. His hair fluttered serenely around his face as Toothless slowly glided along the shoreline.
I'm sure we can convince them, given time, he eventually said, looking apologetically back at Jack. It's just, in the midst of everything, there's too much uncertainty. Astrid...
He stopped himself. Astrid what? Jack asked.
She asked if we'd eaten anything strange, mushrooms or something.
Jack could tell that wasn't what he'd been meaning to say. He looked wordlessly at Hiccup.
She, thinks you died, Hiccup mumbled, and that this Jack Frost is just some deluded way of denying it.
She's not entirely wrong, I guess, Jack mused. I mean, I've died before, or it hasn't happened yet, but it also has from my perspective. You know what I mean. It was Hiccup's turn to stare silently. Jack closed his mouth and averted his eyes. He knew what that look meant. It's fine, Hiccup, he murmured. The older someone gets, the harder it is to keep believing. To make someone believe when they're all grown up, it's almost impossible. It would take a miracle to make an actual adult believe. I told you this would happen. Hiccup's shoulders sank. Then he smiled softly and brushed a finger under Jack's chin.
You made me believe, he said.
That's different, Jack said, fighting the bashful smile creeping onto his face. You'd already seen magic when you were little, as Gobber said. That's not something you just forget. The words were out before he could think twice about them. There was an awkward silence in which none of them wanted to mention the elephant in the room. In the end, Hiccup reached over and tapped Jack's staff as if he were afraid it would shock him. Given how Jack had shocked Roughnut, it wouldn't have been a groundless concern.
It never broke, he said, because it was magic.
Jack looked at his staff as well. I guess so. Hiccup's hand hovered over the staff before settling on Jack's knee.
Could you show me?
He asked reluctantly, like he was afraid he was saying something offensive.
Your magic.
Now, Jack couldn't help feeling like his reaction was a bit unfair. Not to Hiccup, but to the twins. When they had asked to see his powers, he'd always felt a tinge of annoyance. The twins' curiosity, though better than their fear, had always made him feel like a circus monkey. Still, they were only curious, just like Hiccup was now. Except Hiccup's curiosity only felt like acceptance. It felt like the relief he'd felt when the Guardians finally trusted him, and the euphoria he'd felt when Jaime saw him for the first time. Jack doubted he succeeded hiding that relief, but he still tried covering it up with a carefree smile. Sure, he said. He raised his free hand and noted how Hiccup tracked it with his eyes. He made a swirling motion, letting particles of snow glitter between his fingers. Snowflakes flurried around his hand, and Hiccup made a soft sound of awe. Jack felt himself smile. He flicked his hand upwards, and the snow darted towards the clouds like fireworks. It disappeared into the white, and a moment later, big, picturesque snowflakes gently descended. Hiccup's lips slowly pulled into a smile.
Did you do that? He asked. You can really make it snow?
Did it really take you that long to catch on? Jack snorted. Hiccup huffed a laugh.
It's just...
He started, then trailed off for a few seconds. He lifted a hand and let a couple of snowflakes drop into his palm. He chuckled.
Well, beautiful.
Those words shouldn't have embarrassed Jack as much as they did. It was stupid. Winter was beautiful. That was nothing new. Yet Hiccup made it sound like an intimate compliment. Jack suppressed another smile, studying Hiccup's expression as Hiccup studied the falling snow. He was about to make a sleazy, overly confident comment about his winters, but as he opened his mouth, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over him. He didn't realize he'd fallen forwards before, in the next moment, he found himself hanging halfway off Toothless while Hiccup held him back, calling his name. He quickly sat back up, keeping a hand on Hiccup's shoulder to steady himself.
What just happened?
Hiccup's brows flew up to his hairline.
You passed out.
No, I just... Jack started, but closed his mouth when Hiccup sent him a pointed look.
For how long? Just a few seconds, but...
Hiccup tilted his head to the side, worriedly examining Jack's face.
I thought you were getting better.
I am, Jack insisted, though he didn't feel it. It's just when I use my powers. It'll be okay, he quickly said when Hiccup raised his brows again. It's not dangerous. It actually means I'm getting stronger.
How does that make sense?
Hiccup asked. You'd have to ask North, Jack mumbled. Anyway, fever or not, I'm stronger than snow. I'll push through. He nodded determinedly, but Hiccup still didn't look convinced. Jack took a deep breath. You know what? I'm going to regret saying this, but I think I know something that might help. It's always helped me before, anyway. Hiccup slowly started smiling.
Do you really think Gothi's magic tricks have any effect on you?
I'll die a second time before I ever underestimate Gothi, Jack vowed. Besides, her stew tastes weirdly similar to whatever North fed me the first time I got sick. Maybe he got the recipe from her. The last part was delivered as a joke, but Hiccup nodded solemnly.
Wouldn't surprise me if she lived 1,000 years, he said, if she hasn't already.
Jack laughed. Take it from an actual immortal? It wouldn't surprise me either. It wasn't until they landed on Gothi's porch that Hiccup seemed to realize something that Jack had been preparing himself for the entire way there. His fist hovered over Gothi's door, his eyes cutting to Jack. Jack just shrugged. Gothi knows about magic. You might be able to convince her.
And what if it doesn't work?
Hiccup asked. I have a feeling she'll believe me when she sees a floating bowl of stew slowly getting emptied by an invisible entity. Hiccup looked like he didn't know if he should laugh or not.
Fair point,
he said, and knocked. Gothi opened the door, and her eyes immediately settled on Jack. She looked surprised, but not confused, and a moment later the O of her mouth turned into an impressed smile. Jack was surprised that he didn't feel, surprised that Gothi could see him. Like he'd said, he would never underestimate her again. Jack asked her about the stew, and Gothi gestured for them to come inside. Hiccup sent Jack a bright smile, one which made Jack's chest twist, like a silent laugh. It didn't take Gothi long to prepare the stew, and it made Jack wonder what it was exactly that made it so effective. But after seeing Gothi perform an actual magical ritual, he didn't feel the need to ask. He accepted the bowl from Gothi with a grateful smile and sat at the edge of her balcony as he ate. Hiccup sat beside him, swinging his legs, just as unafraid of the height as Jack. Toothless rested behind them, nibbling on some fish Gothi had offered him. It was still snowing. Jack didn't use any extra power keeping it up. He thought the wave of exhaustion was due to the defenses he'd put up and not the little show he'd made for Hiccup. He could explain that, but it was much more enjoyable watching Hiccup in the corner of his eye as he peered thoughtfully at the snow and then at Jack, like he would be able to figure out how the magic worked if he stared long enough.
Doesn't taste any better in spirit form,
Jack commented under his breath, because even if the door was closed, he didn't want to risk being overheard. Hiccup looked at him quietly for a few seconds.
We have to make a plan, he said.
Jack studied the remains of the stew. I have a plan, he said. Protect you, fight snow.
That's not a plan.
It worked with Pitch.
Pitch?
Hiccup shook his head.
What if they break through? And what if you're not strong enough to fight her in this state?
Jack wanted to insist that he would be strong enough to fight her, but he knew that wouldn't reassure Hiccup. He peered out at the horizon, or at least where he thought the horizon would be if it was possible to see through the white haze. Warn the others to stay vigilant, that you might get attacked, he said. Same as last time. If my defense works as it should, the dragons won't be affected by your magic, so you can fight if it must come to that. The Snow Queen, he exhaled shakily. Beating her is not what worries me. It's how I'll beat her. I don't want to kill her. No matter how evil she is, I don't want that on my hands. Hiccup's expression softened.
I get that,
he said, and his hand moved an inch towards Jack before stopping. Jack looked at it for a moment, raised a brow at Hiccup, and took his hand. Chicken, he told him. Hiccup laughed.
That's not very romantic.
I don't know anything about that, Jack said.
By the gods, we know that.
Oh, shut up about that already. Hiccup snickered. He brushed his thumb over the back of Jack's hand, watching him fondly. But a shadow soon passed over his face, and he averted his eyes with a sigh.
Do you know when she will be here? Can you still feel her?
Jack nodded. Do I still have the mark? He asked. Hiccup tilted his head to the side, squinting at Jack's cheek.
Barely, he said. Either it's fading or your skin is too pale to see it.
He looked amused, meeting his eyes again. Jack noted how close their faces were again. He glanced at Hiccup's lips, and though it was brief, Hiccup still noticed. Neither of them said anything for a couple of seconds. "Kiss me?" Jack said. He hadn't meant to make it a question, but his self-consciousness caught up with him at the last second. Hiccup's smile slowly widened. Jack held his breath, only tilting his head slightly upwards as Hiccup leaned in and pressed their lips together. He didn't even notice that he closed his eyes, nor how his free hand let go of the bowl of stew in favor of brushing it across Hiccup's jaw, nor the contented sigh that was making its way from his chest before it was out. The moment was over when the now unattended bowl slid from Jack's lap and off the balcony. Jack jerked away and tried to reach for it, but it was gone. He grimaced as he watched it topple down the mountain. "I forgot I could fly just now," Jack muttered, turning a nervous eye to the door. It was still closed. Time to go?"
"Go where?"
Hiccup asked, sounding a bit dazed. "There's still one more thing I'd like to do," Jack said. He got to his feet and held out a hand to Hiccup, helping him up. "I need to keep our fight off the island. I can't accidentally cause another avalanche here."
"That was you?" Hiccup yelped. "But it was a lightning strike. I saw it happen."
"Even I'm not entirely sure why my magic works the way it does, but yeah, that lightning strike was all me," Jack said before holding up their intertwined hands. "Want to give flying another go?" he asked with a smirk. Hiccup hesitated.
Toothless needs me to get down from here, so..."
Jack laughed. "Okay, then," he said, but didn't let go of Hiccup's hand. He didn't want to. But alas, they had a job to do, so in a swift motion, he raised Hiccup's hand to his mouth and kissed it. "See you by the docks." And then he fled before Hiccup could see the embarrassment on his face. As he flew over the village, he tried spotting Jaime or the twins or just anyone, but it seemed they'd all finally given in to the weather and retreated to the safety and warmth of their homes or the Great Hall. He wondered what Jaime was up to. Was he still trying to convince the Dragon Riders? It wouldn't have been surprising, and Jack had to admit he kind of hoped that was the case. But what he'd said to Hiccup was true. He had little faith in making anyone over the age of 14 believe in Jack Frost or the Snow Queen, no matter how superstitious these Vikings were. He dropped down on the pier and gazed across the ocean. Still there was no sign of her, but Jack could feel her magic vibrate in the air. They didn't have much time left, and Jack had to make a decision. He had to rid the archipelago of the Snow Queen's threat for good, no matter his own feelings about taking a life. There was a thud behind him, and he turned around to see Hiccup jump off of Toothless's back. He squinted in the cold, raising an arm to cover his face from the snow, which, and Jack only realized this now, had begun to fall with more force. He didn't know if it was because of the Snow Queen or because of his own emotions, and the fact that he couldn't be sure scared him. He tried calming himself, but the weather did not ease. "You should take shelter soon," Jack said, speaking loudly to be heard over the wind. "It'll only get worse from here on." Hiccup frowned.
"I don't want you to fight alone," he said.
"I'm the only one who can fight her," Jack protested.
"But I can still help. Distract her. Something."
Hiccup stepped closer, Toothless coming up behind him. In the sharp wind, Hiccup had an expression on his face that reminded Jack of Stoic, and Toothless kept his head low, his bright green eyes staring up at Jack like a predator about to pounce. Hiccup took out Inferno and ignited it.
"When I talked to her, she told me I could kill her if I found her. Was she lying?"
Jack almost took a step back from the sword. Standing so close to the flame, he could clearly feel the difference between Jack Frost and Jackson Overland. He guessed that meant no more cuddling by the firelight. Shame. He hesitated. I'm not sure," he said. "I haven't seen it happen before, a human killing a spirit, but..." He eyed the sword, biting the inside of his lip. Then he abruptly reached out and grabbed the flaming blade before even faster pulling away again with a yelp. Hiccup's mouth hung open, looking like his brain was struggling to catch up with what had just happened.
"Jack, what the... Why?"
he exclaimed, quickly sheathing Inferno as if he was afraid Jack would try it again, even as he was jumping up and down and clutching his wounded hand. Jack bit back a whimper. If it can hurt me, it can hurt her, he croaked. I don't know if it can kill her, but it sure feels like it, he grimaced, looking at his palm. The wound wasn't red, but rather a dark bluish-gray. He blew on it, covering it with a layer of frost, before Hiccup could notice his lack of blood flow.
You are so unimaginably stupid sometimes, Hiccup told him earnestly.
Jack shrugged. Still, Freya said I'm the only one powerful enough to defeat her. You saw what happened on Glacier Island. If you walk into that... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Hiccup's expression went bleak, but he still set his jaw stubbornly.
That was just a taste of what devastating winter is usually like, he proclaimed.
Hiccup, Jack said, and couldn't keep the laugh out of his voice. Don't call me stupid and then go ahead and say something like that. I'll deal with the Snow Queen.
And if you have to kill her?
Hiccup asked. I do have to kill her, Jack said. I've tried to reason with her many times. It won't do. I'll do it. I have to, for everyone's sake. They both knew he was trying to convince himself rather than Hiccup. He sighed and turned around. Hiccup made a choked noise when Jack jumped from the pier. The sea was already mostly frozen over, so Jack didn't know why he was surprised. Though he supposed he had just witnessed a scene about walking on ice, that probably hadn't left him feeling optimistic. Jack touched down on the ice, and he felt it freeze even more, getting thicker beneath him. He started walking outwards, then looked over his shoulder and nodded for Hiccup and Toothless to follow. It's safe, he said. Thick enough for a death match. Toothless jumped down first, and Hiccup let himself down carefully, leaning on Toothless not to slip.
But you can both fly, he said. When you said off the island, I thought you meant in the air.
Jack shrugged. Better safe than sorry. The ice growled beneath them, echoing in that strange, mystical way that it had the last time Jack had frozen the sea. Hiccup's eyes widened.
It wasn't a dream, he said.
Jack did a little ta-da gesture. And that was when I was human. Imagine what I can do now, he said. And I'm powered by Gothis too. Snow doesn't stand a chance. Hiccup looked around, his lips slightly parted as he listened. There was wonder in his eyes, and yet when he looked at Jack again, he managed to look grim.
I'm not backing down on this, he said. I won't let you fight alone.
Hiccup?
No, Hiccup said. If she manages to break through your defense, we have to fight back. We did it before. We can do it again.
She's stronger now, Jack said. She'll use you to get to me, like she did with Jaime last time. Hiccup walked up to Jack and took the wrists of his wounded hand, turning his palm up. Whatever he made of what he saw, his expression didn't reveal it.
You said I am a part of this world now, he said, meeting Jack's eyes. If that's true, I'll protect it, just like I've always protected my world.
Jack was quiet. He knew he couldn't order Hiccup to do or not do anything, no matter how much he wanted to protest. Still, the fierceness in his voice made Jack's chest swell with pride. Because of course Hiccup was going to fight to make his world a better, safer, happier place. That's what he'd always done. Jack couldn't help but think he'd make a wonderful guardian.
Compromise, Hiccup said. I'll let you fight her first. Maybe you'll take her down immediately. Who knows what Gothi put in that stew?
Jack snorted, closing his eyes.
But if it takes too long, I will come and help you.
He opened his eyes again. Hiccup stared back at him, completely unrelenting. Because Hiccup's stubbornness was relentless, and his loyalty even more so, and his courage, and his compassion, and his... Jack groaned before hugging Hiccup tightly. Don't you dare die, he whispered. Hiccup laughed softly, wrapping his arms around Jack's chest.
I won't.
Dying is not fun. It really stings, actually.
I believe you. You're the expert.
Jack smiled as he pulled away. He opened his mouth to speak, but just then felt a ripple on the side of his face. He sucked in a breath. Go warn the others, he said, bringing a hand to the Snow Queen's mark. She's coming. The great hall was packed with villagers who all acted as if this was merely an inconvenience than an oncoming storm. Jaime supposed that an oncoming storm was merely an inconvenience in the Berkians' eyes. After all, they dealt with this every year. They just didn't know that this year's devastating winter might live up to its name in the worst of ways. Jaime pushed through the cloud, looking for the twins. He had to know if they'd made any progress, or if they still only had Gobber on their side. What would they do if none of the Berkians were prepared for what was to come? Maybe Hiccup had a brilliant idea, but he was nowhere to be seen either. He'd gone after Jack, and he had been gone ever since. At least the two of them seemed to have found a silver lining in the middle of all of this. Jaime went in a wide circle around the great hall, and in the end came back to the table where the dragon riders had settled. Fishlegs eyed the front door nervously, absently patting his snoring meatlad by his side, as if he was expecting the storm to break through at any second. Snotlout looked bored, seemingly making a half-hearted attempt at flirting with Astrid, but when she ignored him, he went back to looking bored. Astrid scanned the room, her brows knitted and her mouth pursed. But when she spotted Jaime, her expression softened. "Have you seen Hiccup?" Jaime asked, coming to stand by the end of the table. "Not since he suddenly flew off earlier," Astrid said, clearly puzzled. "He must be in here somewhere, though. Probably doing a count of the villagers. Stoic usually leaves that job to him." "Have you seen Roughnut and Toughnut, then?" Astrid looked around as if only realizing then that the twins weren't with them. No," she said. "They've been running around all day doing Thor knows what." "You know what they've been doing," Jaime said. Astrid stared at him. "I know what they think they've been doing, but let's just say this isn't the first time they've been convinced of something so nonsensical." Jaime gritted his teeth, but before he could argue, Stoic's voice reached them.
"Gobber's lost his marbles," he was saying to Spiteloud. "Not that that's unusual, but this is new even for me."
"Stoic!" Jaime yelled, so loudly it even made Stoic himself flinch, his head snapping around to him. He felt proud of that. "Gobber hasn't lost his marbles. He's telling the truth, and you have to believe him. Berk depends on it." Stoic's expression looked somewhere between surprised and murderous, though the second one Jaime had learned was just a part of his neutral expression. Spiteloud smirked, mumbling something to his chief before disappearing into the crowd.
"Jaime," he said, "I heard you, Hiccup, and Jack disappeared again yesterday."
"Yes," Jaime said. "Jack was kidnapped by the Snow Queen, and now she's coming here. We have to help Jack defeat her." He'd always believed that the truth was the way to go, but judging by Stoic's baffled expression and the quiet snickers from Snotlout, maybe he would have to reconsider. "Jaime," Astrid said mildly, coming up to his side. She had a pained look in her eyes, but she did a good job at keeping her face under control. I understand this might be hard for you to understand, but the archipelago is a very dangerous place. These things, they happen, no matter how impossible they feel. Your brother was a brave—" "What? No, he's not dead, or—" Jaime hesitated, then realized his hesitation probably wouldn't help Astrid believe him. He shook his head when Astrid's face softened in pity. "He's not dead. He's not. He's Jack Frost, and he's going to protect us." In the corner of his eye, he saw Stoic attempting to retreat. He grabbed his arm before he could and stared fiercely up at him. "You have to believe me," he said. "You don't know the first thing me, Jack, and Hiccup saw out there. The Snow Queen is real, and if we don't help Jack, this will be the last winter you ever see." He would have preferred Stoic's chiefly anger over his fatherly compassion in that moment. Stoic sighed quietly and put a hand on Jaime's head.
"Maybe you're right. Maybe he is still alive," he said, clearly not believing it a second. "But right now I have a village to look after. We have to worry about Jack later."
"I'm not worried about Jack. I'm worried about the Snow Queen," Jaime protested, but Stoic was already walking away, not quite disappearing into the crowd due to his side. Jaime balled his hands into fists and turned around to the dragon riders. "What will it take to make you believe me?" "Believe what exactly?" Snotlout asked. He tried for a smirk, but it didn't even look like he had the energy to do that. He probably also thought Jack had died tragically. In some messed up way, it was nice to see that he cared. That the Snow Queen, a character from a story made to scare kids, is actually real and about to attack us, or that Jack was actually magical all along, just like Rough and Tough thought. "Both," Jaime said. "Well, maybe not exactly the way the twins thought, but they were onto something." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Snotlout said, and Fishlegs elbowed him. "He just lost his brother, idiot," he tried murmuring under his breath, but he wasn't a good whisperer. "Stop saying he's dead. He's not dead," Jaime yelled. "He's not dead." All four pairs of eyes turned to Hiccup, who, along with Toothless, had all but materialized from thin air. There was an intense light in his eyes. Jaime knew they didn't have much time left. Hiccup, Astrid said, her voice turning stern. You have to snap out of this. We've lost people before. This isn't like you.
Jack isn't lost, Hiccup said, with a faint tremor in his voice. And Jaime's telling the truth. Remember the attack on Berk right before we disappeared? That was the Snow Queen too, but that was just a warning. This is the real thing. She's out to hurt us for real this time.
Astrid, Snotlout, and Fishleg stared at him. Even Meatlag stared at him. Hiccup walked up to Astrid and placed his hands on her shoulders, looking intently at her.
What I said about Jack is all true, he said. Do I look crazy to you?
No, but you sounded,
Astrid replied. The corners of Hiccup's lips quirked upwards. He sighed.
I guess I do,
he said, and stepped back.
If you don't believe me, there's not much we can do about it. But you still have to be ready. Berk will probably be attacked today.
Nobody would attack in the middle of his dorm,
Fishlegs protested.
The Snow Queen would,
Hiccup said with a shrug.
Keep ready. I need to go talk to my dad.
Where's Jack?
Jaime asked. Hiccup turned to him, and a strange, sort of melancholy shadow passed over his face. He led Jaime a bit away from the others.
Jack is setting up some sort of protection around the island, he said. The Snow Queen will be here soon. I'm going to need you to stay here, all right?
Jaime tried not looking at his new sword.
But what if she breaks through?
She might,
Hiccup admitted.
I'll talk to my father. Even if we can't make them believe in Jack, we can still prepare them for battle. Magic or not, they won't go down without a fight. And Jaime...
He hesitated again, his eyes starting away for a moment before he crouched to get on his eye level.
We might not have a lot of time left. I just wanted to say I never had any siblings. I mean, you could argue the Dragon Riders are like siblings to me, but they're not exactly... Anyway, he grimaced. What I'm trying to say is, I'm very glad to have known you. I'll miss... well...
His face fell, and Jaime felt his heart sink.
He told you?
He asked. Hiccup smiled sadly.
We'll get you home soon, he said, and then we'll see what happens.
He didn't sound optimistic, but Jaime tried to smile encouragingly. When that didn't work, he threw his arms around Hiccup.
I'll miss you too,
he choked out. Hiccup hugged him back, but it didn't take long before he pulled away. His expression had turned grim.
It might not be possible to make Astrid and the others believe, but it won't hurt to keep trying, he said. I'll see you when this is over.
Jaime nodded.
I'll make them believe,
he said with a conviction he wasn't sure he felt.
Or else they'd just see you smooching on air, and that would be really weird.
A series of mangled emotions passed over Hiccup's face, accumulating into an even shade of red.
Okay then, he said, patting Jaime's head. Being an imp runs in the family. Good luck, Jaime.
He smiled before hurrying off, toothless in tow. Jaime spent a few moments swallowing down the lump in his throat before turning back to the table. He saw that Roughnut and Toughnut had found them as well, and he hurried over to them, slamming his palms on the table.
Since you're so convinced we're just going to sit here and do nothing anyway, he said confidently, let me tell you the story of what we've actually been doing these past month. That's what you want, isn't it?
He sent Astrid a challenging look. Astrid's face was unreadable.
Do tell, she said, as long as you promise to tell the truth. I will if you promise to believe me,
Jaime said.
I will if it seems believable, Astrid retorted.
Jaime laughed suddenly, surprising even himself.
Well, that's the thing about belief, isn't it? He said. You have to choose to open your eyes to what you thought was impossible. From what I've heard, Hiccup's taught you that before.
The Dragon Riders all watched him. Fishlegs made a face like he's got a point. Snotlout shifted uncomfortably. Astrid's eyes narrowed as if she were annoyed by the comparison, but the twins both sent him approving looks. Jaime kept his chin high.
You might not trust me and Jack, he said, but you trust Hiccup, and I know for sure Hiccup can confirm everything I'm about to tell you, down to the very last detail. So, listen closely.
And he started telling them about their adventure, starting with their encounter with Noggin. Jack watched Hiccup and Toothless until they disappeared in the whiteout. He put a hand on his cheek, tracing the Snow Queen's mark. It was still there, after all. Faint, and maybe without as much power as it used to, but still there. And now it was prickling ominously. Snow's presence was all around him. It was strange how different she felt now that he was on par with her. He could tell the sneaking terror sending shivers up his spine was only a fear tactic, and the fact that he could feel her getting closer wasn't entirely intentional on her side. She was checking out the grounds, sizing Jack up, but she couldn't do it without revealing herself. And that was what she'd always done. For all her pomp and grandeur, the Snow Queen had, even from the very beginning, been afraid of Jack and what he might be the harbinger of. Jack only hoped she was right to be afraid. However threatening she perceived him, he wasn't entirely feeling it at the moment. But he couldn't think like that. No matter what, he had to end this today. "Snow, I know you're there," he called out into the storm. "Let's get this over with." The storm raged on around him, no further sign of her. He gritted his teeth and rose up into the wind, drifting along with it for a few seconds. He shot across the sky above the island. If there were any more people left in the village, he couldn't see them, but even the hairy hooligans weren't foolhardy enough to challenge this weather. He flew along the shoreline, trying to notice if there were any holes in the shield, but as with the villagers, it was hard to tell. He couldn't be sure where his winter ended and the Snow Queen started, and maybe that scared him more than any sickness could. Gothi's too hadn't been as helpful as he'd hoped. More than anything, he just wanted to reassure Hiccup that he would be fine. And Jack knew he would be fine. He knew he was stronger than her, sick or not. But there were a lot of people and dragons on Berk. Chances were he wouldn't be able to protect all of them. Even now, he could tell the shield was in danger of breaking. If a battle broke loose, Hiccup would lead them. The hairy hooligans were warriors. They would all come out of this victorious. Hopefully. A shape in the corner of Jack's eye distracted him from his grim thoughts, but when he turned around, there was nothing but white. He turned around again, but all he could see was the hazy shape of Berk below him and nothing else. He couldn't even see the sea stacks or the statues he knew jutted from the ocean, but if he hadn't known better, he could have believed the little island was surrounded by nothing but empty, cold, and endless winter. Anger stirred in Jack's chest. He knew she was trying to intimidate him, biding her time. But the longer he had to wait, the harder it was to keep the shield up. She probably knew that. "Snow!" he yelled again. "I don't enjoy being ignored." Which, he belatedly realized, was even more reason for her to do exactly that. Still, Jack could feel her presence, or more like he could feel her will fight against his own. The struggle was visible in the fluctuation in the storm, how it kept blowing up and calming down in uneven intervals. Faint pain rippled through Snow's mark. And Jack was, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, scared. Scared that she could control him, but somehow even more so scared that they could control each other. That their powers came from the same source, that they were the same at their core. Two winter spirits, and all that sets them apart was that Jack was stronger. What reason did Jack have to be a benevolent spirit? What stopped him from becoming just another tyrant like the Snow Queen? Jack clenched his eyes shut. He couldn't start thinking like that now. A sudden prickle on the back of Jack's neck made him gasp and turn around. Still, he saw nothing, but he knew what was happening. Something was trying to get through the shield. It felt like static electricity brushing across his skin, only sharper and a lot more distracting. Snow's puppets. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were fighting to get through. Jack raised his hands, willing the shield to prevail. His vision started swimming. Just that, and he already felt weak. If what occurred on their way back to Berk repeated itself, what would happen? What could he do? He'd barely been able to keep himself airborne, even while knowing Hiccup's life was on the line. "Trust what North said. It's because you're getting stronger," Jack tried to tell himself, but just as soon, the reassurance was interrupted by another voice. "Not yet, you're not. Before you become strong, you'll be vulnerable. By the time you come into your true power, it'll be too late." Again, something flickered in the corner of his eye, and he whirled around. Nothing. "I can fight through it," Jack muttered out loud, attempting to drown out the internal voice. "I've done greater things, even while I was human. I just need to control it." But he thought of the way he'd shocked Roughnut, or the way he'd frozen North's workshop, even in his sleep. The blizzard he'd created the first day on Berk. The avalanche he'd accidentally set off. Even after being Jack Frost for 300 years, there'd been moments where he'd lost control, like the blizzard of 68. How could he be certain that wouldn't happen now as well? "It's too much. I can't protect them all." "Stop it!" Jack hissed, pressing a hand against his temple. "Stop it!" And then he realized he'd been in this situation before. He opened his eyes, looking around. His inner voice almost seemed to falter. No, it wasn't his voice at all. "Snow, you can't trick me," he bellowed into the wind. "I faced down the personification of fear itself before. You don't scare me." The wind whistled in his ears, and with it came a soft hiss of a laugh. Jack gripped his staff, peering into the white nothingness. And suddenly she was there, hovering in front of him. "Frost," she said, with a small nod as greeting. Jack didn't have time to reply before something slammed into him from the side. His mind spun, and when he got back his bearings, he looked up just in time to see Snow make a chopping motion with her hand. A violent wind sent Jack plummeting, and he crashed into the ice. The impact created a spiderweb around him and knocked the air out of his chest. He gasped through unwilling lungs, patting the ice around him for a staff. Snow landed softly a few meters away, her expression blank, and her head tilted analytically to the side.
"Dear," she said, "you look dead already."
Hiccup trailed after Stoic as his father weaved through the cloud, distributing woolen blankets, making sure everyone was all right, all while promptly ignoring his frantic son.
"Can you please listen to me?" Hiccup snapped. "Jack warned you last time that there would be an attack, and there was. Now I'm warning you. We will get attacked, and we have to tell the others." "Attack?" Mrs. Uck asked as he accepted the blanket. "What's he on about, Stoic?"
"Some nonsense," Stoic said, voice pointed. "Hiccup, we're in the middle of a blizzard. Nobody's stupid enough to attack in this weather. Your ravings have already affected Gobber." As if on cue, Gobber's voice carried through the room.
"Snow Queen."
"Aye, you heard me.
This is the time to fight back."
Hiccup appreciated his enthusiasm, but had a nagging feeling it wasn't doing any good.
"Well, forget about the Snow Queen, then,"
Hiccup pleaded.
"But at least warn the villagers about what might be coming."
"Might be," Stoic repeated with a snort. "I thought you said it was coming."
"It's maybe. Hopefully not, but I have a feeling,"
Hiccup said. Stoic sent him a look.
"Jack is trying to hold them off,"
Hiccup explained. Stoic sighed. "Keep your voice down. We don't want to cause unnecessary panic." And he continued handing out blankets. Hiccup raked his hands through his hair in frustration.
"Fine,"
he muttered under his breath and marched over to the first table he could find. Ignoring its current occupants, he stepped onto the bench and then the table and cleared his throat.
"Harry Hooligans!"
he bellowed at the top of his lungs. The room went suddenly quiet. So suddenly, Hiccup momentarily forgot what he was going to say.
"That's a first,"
he mumbled before straightening his back. In the crowd, he spotted Astrid. She looked horrified, but Hiccup still looked to her for courage. He took a deep breath.
"This is not our usual devastating winter. This is something worse. Something evil. We need to act, and I need you to listen."
He'd just been getting into the flow of it when he was grabbed by the scruff of his neck and yanked off the table. Stoic pulled him away to the side of the room to the sound of laughter from the villagers. "Hiccup horrendous haddock." Hiccup gritted his teeth, but stared defiantly back at Stoic.
"The third,"
he finished dryly.
"Dad, I can't just sit around and wait for the Snow Queen's forces to round us up like game. Jack is out there."
"I don't know what Jack told you," Stoic interrupted, "but people are already scared enough as it is. If they start panicking while we're stuck in here—"
"They should start panicking," Hiccup yelled. "At least they will if we don't prepare them."
"Prepare them for what?" Stoic exploded. Hiccup smacked a hand to his forehead.
"I've already told you 1,000,000 times," he lamented. "There is more to this world than we thought, Dad. Jack is living proof of that, which he could have told you, but you have to believe in him first. And right now, he's out there defending Berk from what could be the greatest threat we've ever faced, the Snow Queen."
Stoic's mouth was hanging open. From the other end of the hall, Gobber's booming voice echoed at least the essence of what Hiccup had just said. "Hiccup," Stoic said, his voice softer now. He awkwardly put a hand on his shoulder. "I know how you feel. Losing your boyfriend is a—" Hiccup inhaled so fast he almost choked on his tongue.
"Sorry, what?"
he spluttered. Stoic looked unimpressed. "What? I'm your father. Thought I wouldn't notice." Hiccup's mind marathoned through the 5 stages of grief. He opened his mouth and was for a moment scared of what kind of flustered word vomit was about to emerge from it, but fortunately or unfortunately he never got that far. The doors of the great hall burst open, letting in brutal winds of whip-like snowflakes. The magical aura was so obnoxious, Hiccup felt like he would choke on it. Someone struggled to close the doors again, but even when they eventually succeeded, the air remained thick with it. Hiccup shivered.
"I have to go,"
he murmured and fled into the crowd.
"Toothless!"
A few indignant yelps to his left told him that Toothless had just shouldered his way through the crowd. Hiccup put a hand on his head, looking gravely at him.
"I can't just sit here without knowing what's going on out there,"
he told him, as if he needed Toothless's permission. If that were the case, he didn't need to worry. Toothless just bowed his head in understanding and started heading for the door.
"Hiccup!"
Astrid grabbed Hiccup's arm, turning him around.
"What in Helheim was that?"
Hiccup didn't have the time or patience to explain it another time.
"I'm gonna help Jack," he said. "Believe it or not, Astrid, we're not safe. Stay alert."
He shrugged out of her grip and bolted for the door. Before any of the people standing guard understood what was happening, Hiccup removed the plank keeping the door shut, and that was all it took. The door sprang open again, and the wind was enough to send Hiccup stumbling backwards. Toothless steadied him, and Hiccup jumped onto his back. "Hiccup!" he heard Stoic exclaim, but he was too far away to stop him. Toothless shot out into the blizzard. The great hall disappeared in a haze behind him almost immediately. And then there was nothing. Hiccup could barely see his own house, the closest one to the great hall. Toothless struggled to gain altitude, and he was shaking his head, reacting to the magic in the air. Did that mean Jack's protection wasn't working? Thunder rumbled overhead. Was it Hiccup's imagination, or could he see flashes of light through the storm? Was it lightning, or was it the same lights he'd seen on Glacier Island, the spectacle of Jack's and Snow Queen's powers clashing?
"Come on, bud,"
Hiccup called, and without needing to even vocalize where he wanted to go, Toothless turned towards the faint flashes. They flew for about 4 seconds before something huge and white emerged from the haze, coming straight at them. Toothless narrowly avoided it, barrel rolling before regaining his balance. Around them, the storm seemed to lessen for just a moment, long enough to glimpse their attacker, camouflaged in the snowfall. A crude imitation of Toothless himself. Toothless made a noise somewhere between a whine and a growl, and Hiccup could only agree. Snow Toothless paid it no mind. It shot at them again, and the fight was on. Hiccup ducked as Snow Toothless blasted something at them. Not plasma like Toothless could, but still a pretty good imitation. He only hoped the Snow Dragon's magic was only a piece of the Snow Queen's magic, though if it was, he dreaded what Jack was facing right now. A light show erupted in the whiteout as Toothless and Snow Toothless faced each other down, magic and Toothless's plasma narrowly avoiding each respective target. The puppet was so elusive, Toothless was forced to fly in bold, jerky motions, and Hiccup could barely focus on the fight and manning the tail fin at the same time. And then, for a moment, the air cleared and Jack's voice echoed from the sea. Hiccup couldn't tell what he was saying, if he was saying anything or just bellowing in either rage or pain. The curtain of white slid shut again, and suddenly the whole world was spinning. It wasn't before they hit the ground that Hiccup realized the puppet must have rammed into Toothless, making Hiccup's head collide with Toothless hard enough to stun him. "Toothless!" Hiccup rasped, staggering to his feet. As the sky thundered again, the Toothless-shaped thing swooped at him from the fog, and Hiccup acted on instinct, unsheathing Inferno and igniting it just as Snow Toothless barreled into him. He hit the ground hard enough to make his ears ring. He dimly registered that he couldn't breathe, and then something tore into the skin of his chest. Hiccup let out a choked scream, then Toothless was there, and they were both gone. Head still spinning, he sat up and touched his chest. His fingers were flecked with red. So, Jack was right. Snow really could hurt them now. Hiccup only hoped the wound was more superficial than it looked or felt. 5 minutes into this battle, and he was already hurt. Maybe Jack had had a point when he urged Hiccup to stay away. A second time, Hiccup pushed himself to his feet and staggered towards the sound of Toothless's snarls. He knew they couldn't be far away, but even so he could only barely make out their movements through the haze. With Inferno still in hand, Hiccup charged, only to come to a sudden halt when he saw Toothless pinning his icy counterpart to the ground. Snow Toothless's right wing was cut in half. Toothless's mouth was wide open. A plasma blast turned Snow Toothless's head to, well, snow. The rest of its body was quick to follow. Hiccup winced, though he doubted the puppet could feel any pain, or anything at all. "That was brutal," he commented. Toothless perked up and smiled at what he seemed to assume was a compliment before crawling over to sniff Hiccup's chest. He mewed softly. "I'm all right," Hiccup breathed. "Don't suppose that was it, do you?" He could at least hope. His question was almost immediately followed by a distant scream coming from the direction of the great hall. Hiccup jumped back onto Toothless. At its thickest points, the fog seemed even denser than what it had been the day of the dragon race, but it kept fluctuating, letting up and closing shut again as Toothless flew half blind towards the great hall. Hiccup wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Though he knew the ruckus couldn't be far away, the shouts and clanks of metal sounded distant. Hiccup thought he saw something move, and he ducked just as a white axe barreled right over his head. He could feel Toothless growl, and the dragon started shaking his head a moment before the rest of his body started twitching. They suddenly dropped. Hiccup called his name, but it was only moments before hitting the ground that Toothless seemed to come to his senses. He barely softened their fall, and Hiccup was all but catapulted off the saddle. The scratches left by Snow Toothless screamed as Hiccup rolled across the ground. He managed to push himself up, and when he spit on the ground, there was a splatter of red. He decided it was because he'd bitten his tongue in the fall and not something graver. Toothless was fine, quickly coming to Hiccup's aid, but it was clear Jack's protection wasn't infallible. And if that was true, they might not be able to use their advantage of flight, not that flying in this wind had been easy in the first place. Worst case scenario, it meant the Snow Queen was stronger than they thought, and that she might render the dragons completely at her mercy.
Hiccup!
Hiccup needed Toothless's help to get back his footing, but when he heard Astrid's voice, he snapped back into action, his pain forgotten.
Astrid?
Astrid and Stormfly burst out of the fog. The former was wielding her battle axe, and the latter was twitching her head like she was suffering the same problem as Toothless. Astrid's eyes widened when she saw him and dismounted, rushing up to Hiccup.
A dragon attacked you?
She asked incredulously.
Hiccup shook his head. Snow has a funny sense of humor, he muttered. What's going on?
Astrid looked like she wanted him to elaborate, but just then there was another scream, though this one sounded more like a war cry. She glanced over her shoulder and then quickly back to Hiccup.
The doors kept bursting open. We thought it was the wind, but something was ramming against it, she said. No sane person would ever attack us on our own turf in the middle of a storm, and yet they're here, and we can't even see them properly. Both sane and person might be a slightly inaccurate description in this case, Hiccup said. You're right, Astrid. No ordinary human would ever do this.
Astrid shook her head.
No, that's crazy, she said. What Jaime told us, none of that can be real. You have to tell me it's not real.
Hiccup looked wordlessly at her. Astrid gritted her teeth. Whatever she was about to say when she opened her mouth, the sound of heavy running footsteps distracted her. She whirled around just in time to bury her axe in the head of one of the humanoid puppets, splintering its white helmet and its mock skull completely. The figure staggered, dropping its icy sword, then crumbled like a statue. In the midst of the white rubble lay something fleshy and red. Hiccup had seen this happen before. What looked like an enchanted animal heart freezing over and turning to dust before his eyes. But it made Astrid back away in horror. She muttered something. It might have been a curse or a prayer, and Hiccup steadied her. "Believe me now?" he asked, just as the fog lifted. They were stood near the main square. From here, they could faintly see the stairs to the great hall where a battle had commenced. The villagers were trying to keep the puppets from breaching the doors. For now, they seemed to have it under control, but Hiccup had a feeling they would eventually be overwhelmed if the Snow Queen wasn't taken care of soon. "Oh gods," Astrid said, her voice breathy. "What's she doing?" It took only a moment for Hiccup to realize what she was looking at, or rather, who. Halfway up the stairs, swinging his new Snoggletalk present, Jaime was, somehow, keeping his ground against the snow soldier. Hiccup felt like his life was passing before his eyes as he scrambled to climb onto Toothless again. "He never listens," he exclaimed as they took off. Before the fog had the chance to thicken again, Toothless aimed a blast at the soldier and all but erased it from existence. Jaime scrambled back in surprise, but his face lit up in wonder as Toothless landed. "That was so cool!" he shrieked. "Why are you here?" Hiccup demanded, dismounting yet again to check Jaime for any injuries. "You could have been killed." Jaime seemed unaffected, if not a bit disgruntled. "I've been practicing sword fighting for a reason, haven't I?" he argued. "You even got me this cool sword." "Odin gave you the sword," Hiccup argued, still in the Snoggletalk spirit, apparently. "Well, if it's a God-given gift, it's not my place to refuse it, is it?" Jaime said, with the smug tone of someone who thought they'd already won. "Look out!" someone's voice cried. Hiccup didn't even see what had been coming for them, and the next split second, he and Jaime were wrapped in black, and they were tumbling down the stairs. There was a harsh thump, and Toothless ejected them out of the protection of his wings, only to spring up and snarl at the new enemy. Or rather, an old one. They tumbled off the side of the stairs. Behind them was the mountain wall, and cornering them was a group of soldiers, 6 of them in total, and in their midst was Snow Toothless again. "Oh, come on, that's just unfair," Hiccup groaned. They were surrounded, and judging by Toothless's jerking motions, he was in no shape to fly. It seemed to get worse when the puppets were close. Jaime got to his feet and grabbed Hiccup's sleeve. "We're outnumbered," he said. Hiccup bit back a sarcastic remark. He ignited Inferno, stepping in front of Jaime. "We defeated you once. We can do it again," he said. He didn't think the snow puppets had the ability to laugh, not when they weren't being possessed by the Snow Queen, but he felt like they would have if they could. The fog had grown impenetrable again. If they cried for help, the magical density of it and the sound of battle on the stairs above them would surely drown them out. Hiccup doubted anyone would be fast enough anyway. Snow Toothless opened its mouth and let out a blood-curdling, hissing version of Toothless's roar. Then it charged, and Toothless met it halfway. They rolled away in a wild, snarling whirlwind of black and white. The soldiers charged too. Hiccup gutted the first one. He yelled at Jaime to stay back as Inferno clashed with the ice-covered, or was it pure magically enhanced ice, blade of the next soldier. The soldier lost its footing, and Hiccup deflected the attack of a third one, only to feel the blade of the second soldier bite into his armor. He stumbled back and managed to slice off one of the soldiers, he was already losing track of which was which, hands. That didn't seem too much of an inconvenience for it, as it merely switched the blade to its left hand. Hiccup could tell he was fighting a hopeless battle. His only hope was to outlast them until Jack defeated Snow, but his head was already spinning from pain.
"Toothless!"
he yelled out in between strikes or blocks.
"Take Jaime and go!"
"No!" Jaime objected. Toothless cried out as well, but Hiccup couldn't tell if it was a matching protest or a cry of pain. A blade dug into Hiccup's chin, and he fell back with a guttural scream. For once, he wasn't saved by his prosthetic. He crawled back, hopelessly raising Inferno to block what would surely be the finishing blow. And then Jaime was there, slicing the soldier's leg clean off. The soldier fell to his knees, and Jaime raised his sword as if to decapitate it, but he stopped, his eyes wide with horror. In his hesitation, another puppet took up the fallen one's job. Its wide sword glittered as it came down to Jaime's neck. And then something hit the soldier's back. Hiccup didn't see what it was, because in the next moment, Toothless had jumped in front of them, covering them with his wing. There was a horrible sizzling noise. After a few seconds, Toothless lowered his wing, and what Hiccup saw made his heart rise to his throat. What was left of the puppets was nothing at all, just a patch void of snow, puddles of sizzling liquid sinking into the grass. And standing tall, proud in the middle of it, was a Changewing. No, not a Changewing. The Changewing. Snow shot him into the ice like a baseball, and then immediately went up in smoke. Still, Jack could tell that attack alone had been enough to crack the shield around Berk. It was still there, but keeping it intact was beginning to feel like holding up the sky. He could already tell some of her puppets had broken through. So much for that protection. What kind of guardian couldn't guard? Of course, being here with Jaime was a constant reminder of what kind of guardian that was. But this was no time to beat himself up, though it was getting harder to resist by the minute. Jack rose to the sky again, but it was empty of any snow queens or creepy puppets. His breath was ragged. How did that make any sense anyway? Breathing when he didn't have a heartbeat. Surely he didn't need to breathe. He was practically a corpse, just like Snow had said. Wait. "Snow!" Jack rasped. "Get out of my head!" But how was she in his head in the first place? Because she and Jack were the same. No. Jack clenched his eyes shut, trying to will his body to stop feeling so awfully heavy. And the world was spinning, or was he falling? With a jolt, he saw how close the ice had come. He gasped for breath, bringing a hand to his forehead. It was slick with sweat. No, water. Water because he wasn't human anymore. Water because he was going back soon, back to being alone, back to being an only slightly improved version of a ghost. A pathetic whimper crawled out of his throat. He felt so weak. Hiccup and the others were fighting because he couldn't protect them. He was so weak. "Get it together. Please get it together." He gritted his teeth, and the clouds flashed with lightning. Thunder followed immediately, scaring Jack out of his spiral. Had he done that? He was completely out of control. "I'm out of control. Someone will get hurt. I'm going to hurt someone." The flash of light came from behind him, and even when Jack sensed it, he was too slow to turn around. The magic hit his shoulder and sent him lurching through the air, the winds throwing him hither and thither. Clearly not all the wind sprites were on his side. The Snow Queen looked like a spectre in the snowfall, or was that just because Jack's vision was swimming? He deflected her next attacks, but they came quickly, and she kept gaining momentum. With a guttural cry, he swung out with his arms, and there was a bright, flashing light. The ice shattered far beneath him, but he couldn't see Snow. His chest felt suddenly hollow. Had he? Then he heard her laugh, a laugh that almost sounded genuinely amused. "It's like watching a drunk," her voice sounded, shifting with the wind, seeping into his ears, into his brain. "Or a child. What happened to your bravado, my friend?" Jack growled, lunging out with his staff. His magic shot into the air and disappeared, hitting nothing. "Don't call me that," he hissed. "Stop hiding, you coward." "Name-calling? Come on now." Jack yelped as he dodged an icicle, sharp as any blade, he was sure, and it whistled past him. Then, before he could regain his control, a beam of icy magic hit him in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. He choked and only managed to slow the fall just before he hit the ice again. He pushed himself up, gasping for air. This hardly feels like a fair fight, Snow said. Jack looked up, seeing the hem of her flowing skirt first. Like you ever cared about that, he groaned, tilting his head up. He tried sounding confident when he spoke, but it was hard doing that while his lungs still struggled for breath and his arms shook under his own weight. And it isn't a fair fight. Your power is only a part of what I have. You might be right, Snow said, her voice airy as if in deep thought. As devastating winter is only a part of a longer season, and you are a personification of winter, Jack. You too have something devastating inside you. She frowned. If only you knew how to wield it. Shut up, Jack muttered, lowering his head. Especially not in this state, Snow continued, as if she didn't hear him. I'm almost in awe, seeing all that destructive power bursting at your seams. Or I believe the word I'm looking for is envy. She was quiet for a moment. I can't blame you for losing control. I'm not losing control, Jack snapped. But you are, aren't you? Snow said, mirth in her voice. And it seems in time, maybe I could have learned to control it, control you. With you at my side, I would have been more powerful than ever. But unfortunately, we don't have time, Jack. She opened her arms as if offering an embrace. Aren't you going to fight back? Jack tightened his hold on his staff. Why aren't you attacking? He asked back. Snow's lips twitched in something of a smile. Why, indeed, she said, and she swung her arm towards him. Jack raised his staff instinctively, and like on Glacier Island, they were catapulted away from each other. Jack skidded across the ice before he managed to regain the strength to take to the air. He shot right back at the Snow Queen with a throaty cry. The air crackled. Light flickered and the Snow Queen took off the ground as well, dodging Jack's magic. An icicle formed in her hand, and they threw it like a spear. Again, it only narrowly missed, nicking his ankle. The next seconds, or maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, passed in a flurry of hot and cold flashes. In the midst of it, Jack couldn't tell if any of his attacks landed. More concerning, he couldn't tell if any of Snow's attacks landed. No matter how hard he fought, she didn't seem to be going down. Berk was hidden in the storm. Jack couldn't even know in which direction it was anymore. He didn't know how many of her puppets had broken through, but it didn't matter. All he could do was keep up the shield the best he could. The world was white around him. Snow faded in and out of the fight like she wasn't real at all. Jack's exhaustion was beginning to feel overwhelming. It was all beginning to feel so hopeless and so far away, like a memory, like a fever dream. The storm looked awfully like that day at the North Pole before the time fragment swallowed them. Jack got a terrible feeling he was stuck in that moment, and that everything that happened since... Did it ever happen? Vikings? Gods? A chance at a second human life? An evil winter spirit that seemed to be a reflection of his own dark side? Jack hadn't realized he'd closed his eyes before a sharp noise made him open them again. By then it was too late. Whatever Snow had thrown at him sent him barreling through the air, and suddenly he had no idea which way was up and which was down. His head felt like it was going to implode on itself. Was he alone? Had he been alone this whole time? Wind! Jack gasped. He didn't get anything more out, but the winds that were still on his side seemed to get the message. It pulled him out of his freefall and took him home. He was only aware he'd reached Berk when he crash-landed near the main square. He couldn't hear any sound of battle. No, he couldn't hear anything at all, aside from a high pitch ringing in his ears. He tried pushing himself up only to collapse again. He patted the ground for his staff, but it was nowhere near him. Had he dropped it? Was that why he'd fallen? He'd run away. Jack dug his nails into the ground. Why was he running away? A faint noise made him stir. He pushed himself up and turned to the sound, only to see a humanoid snow sculpture coming running at him with a sword raised. He was too close. Jack didn't have his staff, and he couldn't seem to get up. How stupid was that, dying by the hands of one of the minions and not the big bad villain? Jack hopelessly shielded his face, but the blow never came. Slowly, he lowered his arm. The snow soldier was crumbling, starting from the open fracture in his chest in which a battle axe was buried. Strange thing was, Jack recognized that battle axe. He had been threatened by it before. He turned around. Astrid stood with her hand out, looking mildly shell-shocked. But more importantly, she was looking mildly shell-shocked right at Jack. "Astrid?" Jack asked against hope. Astrid's mouth became wider. "Whoa," she croaked. "It's true." Jack struggled to his feet, suddenly filled with the strength for it. "Astrid," he said again, smiling for the first time in what felt like hours. It's me. It's Jack." "Oh, finally," came a new voice, Toughnut. We were almost starting to give up. How thick can you be? Roughnut agreed. The two of them had landed silently on Barf and Belch and were sending Jack some poorly concealed gawks. Behind them was Hookfang and Meatlug along with their riders. Fishlegs, Snotlout, Astrid, they were all unmistakably looking at him. Not only that, Snotlout was holding his staff. He jumped off Hookfang and walked warily up to Jack. Found this, he said, handing it to him. Figured you had to be nearby. You look awful. Jack could barely find his voice. He took the staff. Thanks. Not the whole white hair thing, Snotlout clarified, waving his hands in a way that Jack thought could be described as bashful if he hadn't been, well, Snotlout. It suits you. I mean, it looks okay. It's kind of weird. Anyway, what I meant was... I know what you meant, Jack said, and couldn't help but laugh. And oh, it felt wonderful to laugh. He looked around at the others. They all appropriately looked like they'd been through a battle, and felt a pang of guilt. I have to... A shape passed overhead. Jack wouldn't have thought anything of it if it hadn't been for the elated shriek that came from it, and he looked up to see not much at all, and yet he knew exactly what it was. What the Was that a Changewing? Fishlegs asked. He sounded a bit tearful, his eyes darting between Jack and the sky with a wobbly smile. Jack realized he must be relieved to see him alive, spirit or not. Sounded like your brother. That would be him, Jack confirmed faintly. What does he think he's doing? I have to go... Jack, wait! Astrid came up and grabbed his arm, looking a bit puzzled as she did. Wow, you're so cold. Yeah, it's not usually this bad. Astrid shook her head and looked into his eyes. Is everything true, then? These things that we're fighting, they're from the Snow Queen? Everything Jaime and Hiccup have told you is true, Jack said. I'm sorry, Astrid. Everyone, it's my fault she's attacking you. If I gave up, she might back away, but I can't. I have to get Jaime. You've spent enough time on Berk to know that giving up isn't an option, Astrid said, shaking her head. Then she smiled, a bit shakily. But Hiccup believes in you, and he's usually right about this stuff. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is... Jack hugged her quick. Sorry, I just didn't think I'd ever get to do that, he said as he pulled away. Astrid raised her brows, and Jack could only grin at her. Thank you. Just hold out, all of you. He turned to the others, and suddenly things felt normal. The dragon riders looked back at him just as they had done when they had looked at Jackson Overland. Sure, there would be questions after the battle, but right now their eyes were steely and full of the kind of valiant frenzy Jack had only ever seen in the eyes of the hairy hooligans. Against all odds, Jack finally felt like one of them. Hold out, Jack repeated. Don't die. I have to get my stupid little brother. He took off and, when he was sure the dragon riders couldn't hear him, laughed incredulously. He'd had doubts even one of them would believe in him, not in a million years all of them. He'd thanked Jaime for being his wonderful self, but that would have to wait. The only reason Jack found them was because he could feel the Changewing's presence, and evidently she could feel him as well, because she dropped the camouflage when he came closer. Jaime sat on her back, without even a saddle, grinning like he was at an amusement park and not in the middle of a war. Jaime! Jack bellowed. Jaime jumped, his grin shrinking into something a little guiltier. Jack! He said, brows furrowed as he looked closer at him. You look... I know, Jack interrupted and came up to fly beside them. Got it when Snotlout told me, and Jaime, he couldn't help it. The stern older brother face he'd been wearing melted off him like a thawing river, and he grinned. They all see me. You're amazing. Jaime's eyes widened. Really? He gasped, then giggled bashfully when Jack nodded. It was a shared effort. Jack perched on the Changewing's back and ruffled Jaime's hair. Anyway, he said, care to explain why you're on Dragonback in the middle of a battle? She came to save us, Jaime said, affectionately rubbing the Changewing's neck. I don't know why, but suddenly she was there, like she knew I was in trouble. He turned around to look at Jack, frowning. You don't think it's like a motherly instinct thing, do you? Just then, the Changewing gave a shriek and took a sharp turn as something white shot past them. The movement made Jack topple off her back, and as he regained altitude, he saw what had attacked them, a white eagle. And it hadn't come alone. Jaime, get out of here! Jack yelled before he felt talons grab his shoulders and yank him upwards. Freya's cloak kept them from boring into his skin, and he twisted his arm, hitting the eagle's behind. It instantly froze, which solved one problem. He was no longer being kidnapped, but created another. The eagle's talons were still clamped around his shoulders, and, turns out, an eagle-sized ice sculpture is heavier than one might think. Jack rocketed downwards and crashed on someone's roof before tumbling to the ground. The eagle broke off in the process, and Jack struggled to get back into the air. "Jaime!" The world was beginning to spin again. In the distance, he could see the eagle swarming Jaime and the Changewing. The Changewing flickered in and out of sight, trying and failing to keep up her camouflage. Jack flew towards them as fast as he could, but then something happened to the Changewing, making it shriek in pain. It jerked back instinctively, and the motion made Jaime lose his grip. He fell off with a scream. Jack surged forward with speed he didn't know he had. He caught Jaime in his arms, but the weight and momentum was too much. They kept falling. And then he landed, but not on the ground. His head knocked against something yielding, and a wheeze followed.
"That could have gone smoother,"
Hiccup groaned.
"Hiccup!"
Jack and Jaime said in chorus. It was an understatement to say their position was awkward. Jack lay across Toothless's neck, halfway off him, while Hiccup held onto his arms to keep him from falling, while Jack held Jaime in what could be described as a bridal style, but a lot less elegant. Toothless made a questioning noise, as if to ask if they were all right. "I've been better," Jack admitted, and pulled Jaime and himself upright. He turned to Hiccup the best he could, holding onto his shoulder. "You okay, Jaime?" Jaime looked pale, but he nodded.
"What about the Changewing?"
Jack looked up and swallowed. "I think she got away," he said. "If those eagles coming for us is any clue." He gritted his teeth and, as swiftly as he could, levitated just enough to put Jaime between himself and Hiccup, and crouched to keep as little weight on poor Toothless's neck as possible. "There are 6 of them."
"You take 3, we take the other half?"
Hiccup suggested. He sounded strangely calm, or maybe Jack was just so stressed, anyone who wasn't in a complete panic seemed calm in comparison. "Okay, yeah, let's do that," Jack said, trying to match his resolve. He was about to jump off, but remembered something, sending Hiccup a huge smile. "I just talked to Astrid and the others. You two are amazing." Then he jumped straight up and swung his staff. The bright blue dart of magic hit one of the eagles, but it wasn't enough to freeze it like he'd done the other. He'd have to use more power. Something terribly hot shot past him and hit an eagle, exploding it on impact. Jack knew the plasma blast hadn't been that close to him at all, but he still felt as if he'd just been sitting a bit too close to the hearth. He turned around to see Toothless fly in a wide path around him and sent the 3 of them a thumbs up.
"Jack, concentrate!"
Jaime bellowed and pointed. Jack whirled back around, swinging his staff blindly. It connected with something, and there was a cry as the second eagle plummeted, stiff as a statue. If he could get close up to them, he could turn them to ice, inanimate ice, without risking losing control of his powers. He stood still as the eagles caught up.
"What are you doing?"
Jaime yelled from a distance. Jack ignored him. When the eagles were close enough, he shot straight at them. If an ice puppet could be surprised, this one definitely was, as it dodged out of Jack's way. Jack spun his staff as he grazed the eagle's wing, and it connected with his chest. The eagle went down, but in the next second, Jack felt something tear across his chest. He got back to himself a moment before hitting the stairs to the great hall. He touched down on the banister, taking in the chaos around him. Stark white human-shaped warriors fighting against the villagers that had taken it upon themselves to protect the doors of the great hall, and they were almost losing. Just in front of the door stood Stoic and Gobber, fighting side by side with a rhythm that gave away how many times they'd faced down foes together, and yet they were visibly struggling. Gobber was unsteady on his feet, a deep blue bruise across his face. Stoic had a gash on his forehead, blood mixing with the sweat trailing down his temple. Jack wanted to do something. He wanted to help, but there were too many people in between the puppets. His powers were too unpredictable to risk it. Overhead came the telltale whistle of an incoming night fury, and he ducked just as the air above him exploded. Pieces of ice eagle rained down on him.
"Jack!"
Hiccup yelled.
"Are you okay?"
"They need help," Jack said, hating how weak his own voice sounded. Hiccup peered through the fog.
"They've got it under control. Come on."
Jack took a deep breath and kicked off the ground, catching up with Toothless. "Are there any eagles left?" he panted. His answer came in the form of an eagle cry. Jack spun around and went head first for it like he had before, ignoring Hiccup's mangled protest. The eagle dodged Jack's staff, but Jack still barreled into it, catching it in a headlock that probably looked ridiculous. He let out a furious cry, partly to hide the way he would have screamed in pain as the eagle's beak pierced his shoulder. There was a flash of light, and the eagle burst into pieces in his arms. Jack immediately doubled over and gripped his upper arm, hissing with pain.
"Jack, why would you?"
Hiccup's voice sounded far away.
Jack looked up and managed to stay afloat until he could collapse on Toothless's back, behind Hiccup. Hiccup and Jaime both turned to him. Jaime looked afraid, and as did Hiccup, but with a hint of anger as well.
"What was that? What were you thinking? Any more eagles?"
Jack asked.
"No,"
Hiccup said, his hand hovering over Jack's shoulder.
"Why are you attacking them like that? You're getting hurt."
Jack closed his eyes, letting his head fall back.
I can't use too much power," he said. "I'm too unstable. Glacier Island, the avalanche, breathing the ocean."
He winced, pain flaring down the right of his face. He held back a curse.
"She's trying to break through."
He opened his eyes to find Hiccup and Jaime looking back at him with concern. Jack didn't want to admit how scared he was in front of Jaime, but he was sure both of them could see it on his face.
"Jack,"
Jaime said,
"the moon chose you for a reason. It doesn't matter that you're sick. You know how to protect people. That's what you do."
Hiccup took his hand, then jolted like he'd been shocked. Instead of asking, he shook his head and looked seriously at Jack.
"You're fighting with one arm tied behind your back," he said. "But you don't have to be afraid. I've seen with my own eyes the lengths you'd go to protect your loved ones. Even in this state, you'd never hurt anyone." "How can you be so sure?" Jack asked.
Hiccup surprised him by laughing.
"If you met yourself, you'd understand," he said. "Besides, I don't remember much of what happened on the sea after the fairies, but you froze everything, and still not a single frostbitten toe on us. So, I'm pretty sure."
Jack didn't know what to say to that. His head was filled with what-ifs, and the feeling of the Snow Queen's magic beating against the shield didn't help his confidence. But Jack sounded so resolute and assured, Jack had a feeling it wouldn't have mattered which words he'd chosen. The faith he and Jaime had in Jack alone was enough to quiet that voice in his mind. That voice.
"I think she's in my head," Jack blurted. "I think, since I'm a spirit again, we share something at our core."
Hiccup frowned.
"That might be," he said, which wasn't what Jack wanted to hear. But then he smiled. "But even so, you don't have to be afraid. You're not like her, Jack. Remember whose cloak you're wearing."
Freya's cloak seemed to grow heavier on his shoulders, like a reassuring hug. He raised his brows at Hiccup.
"What, you're thinking we're going to defeat the evil queen with the power of love?" he asked.
It was meant as a joke, but Jaime got an odd light in his eyes, and Hiccup shrugged.
"If you want to phrase it like that, then yeah, I guess so," he said. "The moon, Freya, getting handpicked by all these otherworldly entities must be getting to your head."
Jack laughed. "Obviously not."
"Well, it should,"
Hiccup said, then leaned in and kissed him.
"Even Astrid believes in you. Time to believe in yourself."
Cliché," Jaime complained, pretending to be disgusted by the public display of affection. He smiled.
"He is right, though."
Jack couldn't blush, but he thought he felt a little less cold.
"Think of my voice instead,"
Hiccup murmured, his face close to Jack's.
"We'll see you on the other side."
Looking at the two of them, there were a certain string of words Jack felt desperate to say, but he didn't say them. That kind of display of affection was still too scary, at least with Hiccup. But he knew, with crystal clear certainty, that those 3 words wholeheartedly described what he felt. "Keep Jaime safe," he said instead, and squeezed Hiccup's hand. "See you on the other side." And he let himself slide off Toothless, just like he had during his first flight with him. The wind took hold of him instead, and he shot towards the docks and the open sea. It was eerie how the battle was silenced completely when he landed on the ice. He hoped it meant his shield was stronger than he'd thought, at the very least strong enough to keep the Snow Queen out. But now she was quiet. Jack knew that she was there, but she was hiding again. It was as if she knew something was different. "I'm okay now," Jack called out into the air, ignoring how raspy his voice sounded. "Just needed a good pep talk." Jack waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. "Snow, I know you can hear me. Come out now, I'll make you." Could he really do that? He'd barely been able to fight those eagles without passing out. He was wasting his time trying to fight her, while Berk's inhabitants slowly crumpled under the force of her minions. He should help them instead. Jack closed his eyes. No, those thoughts weren't his. Think of his voice instead, he whispered and opened his eyes again. He took a deep breath. Time's up. He raised his arms and stretched out his mind. The wind picked up and snow fell even heavier. The clouds flickered with lightning, its thunder making the ice tremble. Jack gritted his teeth and brought his hands together. Snowflakes from every direction amassed into a flurry in front of him, and Snow tumbled onto the ice, catching herself with her hands. It was a rarity that she showed such open emotion on her face, but this time her surprise was clear as day. This time Jack didn't wait. He pointed his staff at Snow, and she barely had the time to raise her arms in defense. Jack's magic crashed against her shield of ice. It cracked almost immediately, but gave Snow just enough time to collect herself. She kicked off the ground, and it looked as if she were fraying at the edges, like she was trying to disperse and hide again. But Jack forced her to remain in one piece, and he shot after her. When Snow suddenly spun around, she hurled a white spear at Jack. Jack ducked, but it still nicked his cheek, rupturing the remainder of Snow's brand. Then followed a burst of white, and Jack was thrown back. He raised his staff just in time to fend off a jagged blaze of ice, Snow all but materializing right in front of him. Even without the ability to turn into 1,000 snowflakes, she could move almost indiscernibly fast. They fought in a dance much like the one before, except this time Jack felt as if he had the upper hand. At least most of the time. He lost count of how many times he hit the ice, but in return he could tell from his lack of a self-deprecating inner monologue that Snow was too distracted by the fight to mess with his mind. Snow was quiet as she fought, her voice only escaping her whenever she had to defend herself against the stronger bursts of Jack's powers, which came in haphazard waves. It felt like the unpredictability of Jack's fever was working in his favor. Time remained a mystery, but as Jack had foreseen, they both eventually grew too tired to keep themselves airborne. The fight continued mostly on foot. Snow's eyes were alight with anger and fear, fighting with the ferocity of an animal that was aware of its own impending end. It made Jack feel sick to his stomach, but that was also because of the fever. The longer the fight went on, the harder it became to breathe, to see, to move. Channeling his powers felt like balancing on a fence blindfolded. If he tilted to one side, his magic wasn't enough. If he tilted to the other, he could feel inside him a blizzard even worse than devastating winter. Every step was a step in the dark. Suddenly, a dark shadow flashed in the haze behind the Snow Queen, and there was a whistling hiss. Snow's eyes went wide, and she whirled around, the eyes flashing blue as she deflected Toothless's plasma blast. She gave a furious cry. "Hiccup, no!" Jack yelled, but it was too late. Toothless made a pained noise. His form twitched, and he rocketed towards the ground, disappearing into the haze. Jack concentrated, looking for that fine line between dispelling Snow's control over Toothless or only making it worse. And Jack felt himself fall off the wrong side of the fence. The thunderstorm in his chest was stuffing his throat, forcing itself out, choking him. Instead of fixing his magic on that precise point, he felt it surge out of him, blowing out in every direction. The only thing in his mind was Hiccup and Jaime's reassurance that if there was one thing he would never do, it was hurting someone he loved. Had they been wrong? No, Jack refused to believe that. He felt himself fall to his knees, a scream building up and lodging itself in his throat. The sky grew bigger and heavier above him, and Jack held up his arms as if to keep it from finally crushing him and breaking the bonds that held back that last bit of his control. Around him, he felt the storm come to a sudden stop. Slowly, he managed to open his eyes. The Snow Queen was staring at him, standing rigid just a few meters away, her head tilted to the side in a silent question. "You've reached it," she concluded, her voice hoarser than before. "Your limit." Jack exhaled shakily as he tried to find his voice. "That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent," he said. He couldn't lower his arms. They were shaking with the strain. A smile was slowly forming on Snow's lips. "Like a cup about to overflow," she said, taking a few slow steps towards him. "All it would take is a push. And then what? Berk would be destroyed. You'd have nothing to reign over." "Berk is your world, not mine," Snow said. "There are other islands, other people to feed my power." Jack pressed his lips together, raising his chin defiantly. "You'll be destroyed with it," he said, though he wasn't so sure. And judging by Snow's soft sigh, she knew that. "I'll admit, I thought this battle would be the end of me," she said. "So I gave it my all. I can only imagine what the Berkians might be thinking. Better they perish. I need to maintain my invisibility." She raised her hand, a blue light illuminating in her palm. "Goodbye, Jack Frost." And then there was another light, a bright orange one, climbing up the edge of a sword coming down at Snow's neck. Unable to hide his surprise, Snow saw the change in Jack's face, and Jack knew what was about to happen. But it happened too fast, there was no way he could have stopped it. "No!" he screamed as the Snow Queen whirled around and swung her arm. The air flashed white, and before Inferno could reach Snow, Hiccup was blasted away with a strike that had been meant for Jack. Hiccup bounced and skidded across the ice before coming to a stop,
his form halfway hidden in the fog. Jack waited for him to get up. He didn't. Something strange happened. Toothless appeared from the haze and landed next to Hiccup's limp body, and Jack saw who had actually been riding him earlier, Jaime. He jumped off Toothless and ran up to Hiccup's side. Jack wanted to yell at him to hurry up, though he was sure Jaime was being as swift as he possibly could. The world seemed to move through syrup. Jaime sat crouched over Hiccup's form. Then he sat up and looked at Jack. Even from this distance, Jack could see the horror in his eyes. No. Jaime's horror turned to alarm. "Jack, look out!" he screamed. Jack looked back to see the edge of an icicle coming down at his chest. He dropped his arms before he even realized what he was doing, his hand clamping around Snow's wrist. The icicle stopped centimeters away from his heart, and Snow went rigid. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. From where her and Jack's skin met, cracks spread out like spiderweb fractures in ice. Jack yanked his hand back in surprise, falling back, but the Snow Queen remained frozen. He could do nothing as the crack spread up to her shoulder, and only in a heartbeat she was covered in it. And then she crumbled.